Paul has decided to do more cooking at home instead of eating out all the time. In one of his first meals, he has to measure quantities of flour to add to gravy as well as the pie crust for dessert. The recipe for gravy calls for 3/4 of a cup of flour, while the recipe for the pie crust calls for 3/8 of a cup of flour. Use the fraction bars below to model the two quantities of flour and determine which recipe requires more flour. Express your reasoning using complete sentences. Okay, so let's highlight the important parts of this problem here. We know that the gravy calls for 3/4 of a cup of flour, and the pie crust calls for 3/8 of a cup of flour. Now, there's three things we have to do. Let's make sure that we do all three things we're being asked. We're being asked to model the two quantities of flour, so we're going to use the rectangles below. We're being asked to determine which recipe requires more flour, and then the last thing we have to do is make sure we use complete sentences. Okay, so gravy requires 3/4 of a cup of flour, and the pie crust requires 3/8 of a cup of flour. This means that the rectangle divided into 4 equal pieces will be used to represent the gravy, and our rectangle that is cut up into 8 equal pieces we will use to represent the pie crust. So, for the gravy, it's represented by the rectangle that is cut up into 4 equal pieces. So each one of those equal pieces represents 1/4 of a cup of flour. And for the pie crust, each one of the equal pieces represents 1/8 of a cup of flour. Now, for the gravy, 3/4 of a cup of flour means we have 3 copies of 1/4 of a cup. So we're going to shade in 3 of those. For the pie crust, we have 3/8 of a cup of flour. So we're going to shade in 3/8, or 3 copies of 1/8. Now, we can see here that we've shaded a greater portion of the whole for the gravy than we have for the pie crust. So visually, I can tell that the gravy requires more flour than the pie crust. But there's also another way that I can tell that the gravy requires more flour than the pie crust. Since 1/4 is larger than 1/8, we can conclude that 3 copies of 1/4 is larger than 3 copies of 1/8. This means 3/4 is greater than 3/8. So the recipe for gravy calls for more flour than the recipe for pie crust. So our answer is that the recipe for gravy calls for more flour.